All right, everybody. I'm pleased to introduce a friend, a colleague, an inspired being in the field who really cares about bringing value to your lives. Who's actually a researcher as well. She's really been doing a lot of research in the course of her career that has helped inform us of many things. And she's going to talk to us about that. So I'm not going to tell all the secrets right now, okay? She's over here at the University of Montana, which for us in the Reading League Montana, that means a lot. We have our own homegrown researcher. She's born in Montana. So with that, I just wanted to give you a shout out, Julie. I looked through all the handouts. Thank you so much. So everybody, as you're joining, the handouts are in the chat box. Please grab them. I want to let you know that I've been observing in classrooms the exact content is what I've really been looking at in classrooms lately. So I just can't wait to have your insight on this topic to help me become a better coach and to help bridge the theory to practice about what this content knowledge and what you're about to teach. I'm not going to give any secrets away. So take it away.
Well, thank you, Danielle. And thank you again for all your work and helping us to launch this Reading League of Montana. And this is really exciting. And again, I want to give a shout out to you for your amazing work and being able to facilitate this. And so again, the purpose of this really is to think about that science of reading and how do we share our knowledge to be able to also bring that research and bridge that over into practice. And so this is something really important to me. And I'm thrilled to be here. And I know that we've talked a lot about both Dr. Nell and I are speech language pathologists by trade, but we certainly have worked and been part of the educational system, working with teachers, literacy coaches across children with and without disabilities for many years. And so thank you for inviting me and having the opportunity to talk about language as it relates to literacy, and specifically thinking about children with and without developmental language disorders, which will be a topic, but again, doesn't necessarily need to be specific to just those individuals. And then specifically, we're going to think a little bit about the adolescent population because they don't always get as much press. And there's some really exciting things that we can be doing when we think about how to use language to help these individuals, even when they might be struggling with their own reading. So
Julie,
with that, go on. Yes.
Quick,
yes.
I did create a poll to get us thinking about what you might be teaching. So
very good. Let's start out.
This is just a nice little poll to everybody out there. I just remember this is anonymous. Just give us a vibe for where you're at on this question. So here it goes. How do you teach morphology? And the question, it says, how much do you teach morphology? I explicitly and implicitly teach it daily. I sometimes teach it explicitly as it comes up. I know it is of value, but I'm a bit stuck in a knowledge doing gap. I know of it, but I've never considered doing it. I've never heard of it. So go ahead and give us your answers.
Excellent.
Okay, there are about 20 of us on, so when it reaches that number, I will close it. So just a few more answers. Go ahead and pop your answer in. All right, here it is for you. Ms. Julie, you can see the results.
Very good.
Can you see them?
Yes. So it looks like the 70% are noting that they sometimes teach it explicitly as it comes. There's still 10% that this isn't something they've heard of, or that it's not something that they're feeling really comfortable with, another 10%. And some are more actually really implicitly and explicitly teaching that every day. So this is lovely. And, even though this is morphology is not necessarily in the title of this talk, it's going to be a large focus, because when we start to think about these older children, how do we think about the link between sounds, phonology, orthography, and letters, and then finally meaning and morphology? And that is definitely why that preemptive piece that Danielle has brought to as we start to think about what we're going to talk about today, this is an area of linguistics that we're going to focus on. So thank you. Wonderful. Great way to start. So with that, before I go much further, I do want to preface some disclosures. Want you to know where I'm coming from. Danielle had noted that I'm coming from University of Montana. I am, and again, want to disclose my role there. I am an Associate Vice Provost for Innovation in Online Learning at UM. And an affiliate professor of the School of Speech, Language, Hearing, and Occupational Sciences, where I served for over the last 6 years as chair of that school. I also, in my new role as Danielle, as president of our Reading League, I am serving as vice president of that Montana Reading League, and also am co-founder for our University of Montana's Big Sky Language Literacy Institute. So I do a lot of research through there, which is part of my lead lab, my orthography and word learning studies, which again were mentioned earlier and are funded through National Institutes of Health as well as the U.S. Department of Ed. And the focus, again, is on those linguistic underpinnings of language and literacy for success for children with and without dyslexia, as well as developmental language disorder. So let's move forward. In terms of our learning objectives, there are several, but really where I think about the focus for today is that I want to describe the evidence of multilinguistic literacy assessment instruction for students with and without language literacy deficits. And specifically think about what are some things that we might do for adolescents as we think about in the classroom. And that's where I will be ending it today. So we have about the next hour together. And as you've already noticed, Danielle will be dropping questions in the chat. She'll be helping to moderate. If you have questions, drop them in at any time. We'll also be stopping periodically, and Neil will be helping me to regulate that if we have some polls or some stopping points as we go forward to check in on your knowledge. So with that, let's think about what it means to have a language approach to literacy. And so here, as we see in the slide, we start to think about what are those strands. And for the sake of time today, I didn't have much longer, so I didn't go into the full theory of what is, the simple view of reading, as well as Scarborough is one of our researchers who really talks about the strands of reading. But that's really the foundation for what we're going to be thinking about today of how do these different language areas of syntax, which is that grammar system, phonological awareness, phonology or sound system of language, morphology or meaning system of language, orthography, the letter and letter combinations, how we think about those rules of orthography, semantics or vocabulary, and then even memory. How do they come together to help us to understand? And then as teachers and coaches and specialists, how do we help to facilitate those areas in children who may not be who may be having some challenges in their language as well as in their literacy. I'm going to focus specifically on three main areas, and those are the phonological awareness, orthographic knowledge, and morphological awareness. And specifically, I'm doing that because I'm taking from some of the literature, some of our colleagues, Ginger Berninger, for example, refer to this as the triple word form theory, thinking about that these three areas in particular really overlap to be foundational as we specifically think about children with and without perhaps dyslexia and or developmental language disorder. So again, I think many of you are very familiar with, again, phonological awareness and that metalinguistic, the conscious awareness to be able to manipulate and think about language, specifically in the area of our sound system of language, phonological awareness, we know that that is very related to literacy success. But two other areas that you may or may not be as aware of, and again, given the poll, some of you, this may be newer to you, are that of orthography and then morphological awareness. So orthographic knowledge, I use, and right now when I refer to it, I'm really referring to that as in accordance with Ken Oppel's 2011 type of research, thinking about not just sound symbol correspondence, so CH represents the ch sound, but also thinking about letter patterns, our spelling rules. So we double consonants in the middle of words or after short vowels, right? As well as then our constraints in our language. In this case, I talk about phonetic constraints, like you can't start any word with CK at the beginning in the English language, right? Those are constraints. So some of these are very explicitly known. In fact, you might even learn those rules in your classroom. Others are more implicit, just like the doubling of letters or that CK at the beginning of words. No one really maybe taught you that, but children are understanding that through their exposure, through written language in that case. And then finally, this area of morphological awareness, as Danielle has mentioned, is really a key piece to help us be aware of all these linguistic factors. In fact, some of my colleagues, Kirk and I should say Kirby is one of the scholars that I like to cite a lot. He talks a lot about morphology as the binding agent of language because the meaning really helps us to understand and think about different sound and orthography differences. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit, but we can really harness that as we think about how we're teaching and working with our students as we begin to help them crack the code to literacy. And then one other piece that's foundational as we talk about this triple word form theory is this idea of what is an approach in which those multiple linguistic components are harnessed for intervention. This is also referred to as a structured literacy approach. Those of you in the field might be familiar with Louisa Moats, and the International Dyslexia Association often refer to this as a structured literacy approach. Those of us, such as myself, who've been in the field doing this intervention research for a while, have been referring to it as a multilinguistic approach. They're the same thing. And essentially, it refers to a language-focused literacy approach in which explicit and systematic focus on linguistics are found to significantly improve literacy skills for school-age children. Specifically, we found it to be helpful with individuals who are at risk for or diagnosed with developmental language disorders, or essentially a language delay, sometimes referred to as a specific language impairment. Dyslexia, so more reading specific, so at the word level, prior and a little bit separate from comprehension, those of you who know the simple view of reading, and then even spelling deficits. So this is an approach that we're going to focus on today, specifically for those kids who might be a little bit even older in school who still struggle in this area, because we certainly know that that happens. I also note, again, because morphology might be a newer term to you, or if you're really wanting to delve deeper into this today, you know that you have your reference list with you that I have put together, some recent references or references that I think are really on cue with what we're talking about today. But this is another special forum that's relatively recent that I put together with my colleagues here at the time at University of Montana, Dr. Ashley Moe and Dr. Ginger Collins, in a special issue with many colleagues around the country who are focused on morphological awareness as a key factor for literacy success and academic achievement. So please check that out later if you are still also wanting to learn more about different ways to do these pieces. So I'm pausing there. Now, are there any questions that I should know about before I go right into what does it mean to have morphological awareness, and how might we think about this from a developmental perspective, as well as how does that relate to literacy success? I'm looking in the chat. I don't see any questions that have been dropped in, and I don't hear anything from Nell, so I think we're fine. Okay, so with that being said, what is morphologic awareness? Again, I'm referring to that awareness side. Again, from a linguistic perspective, that means that there is this meta awareness where there's this conscious awareness of language, treating it as if it's a thing. And so there's now more explicit awareness of language. And so when there is that explicit awareness, in this case of morphology and morphemes, are the smallest linguistic unit of meaning, that's when we start to see an awareness of morphology and can be really valuable. And we'll talk about what does that look like developmentally. But first off, let's think about what are the different types of morphology and what we see in development. So there are two types of morphology: inflectional morphology, which is earlier developing, and both in spoken language and in written metalinguistic language. This includes, for the most part, awareness of tense, plurality, and possession. And again, developing really early in spoken language. So even as early as the age of 2, we see young toddlers starting to understand and master what it means to have plurality. They might not always get it correct, right? There's 2 cow. So they might not still know that it's the pluralist, but they're learning, right? And so this is starting as early in spoken development. And so by the time we see kindergartners, we are expecting that they will have tense, plurality, possession mastered in their spoken language. And we are also seeing them be able to do that as they learn to read and write and integrate this knowledge in typical development. The other area of morphology does not have to do with what we consider those more grammatical or tense plurality markers. These are derivational morphology is essentially the awareness to change a type of word. So you are adding an affix, either a suffix after, prefix before, to change the type of word. So a verb of teach, in this example, is then transitioned to a noun of teacher. And these types of words develop a little bit later in school children. And in fact, we start to see that as children advance in school, they begin to understand and master this skill. And there are some different theories out there as to whether or not that starts at 3rd grade, that we expect it to be mastered. But really, as early as kindergarten, we are seeing children begin to have implicit knowledge. And this is a skill that's developing all through grade school, high school, even into college, because it really is also jargon specific. In fact, by the age of 3rd grade, about 90% of unknown words are often simply morphological derivatives that students are encountering. And it's mostly because by 3rd grade now, you start to read those textbooks, and you start to read those books where the greater vocabulary depth is happening. It's often morphological derivations that students are encountering. And as such, as we think about older children, that's the power of how morphology helps us, because if we help children to think about a strategy using morphology as a base, then it allows, when they see these unknown words, to not have to know every word. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So again, what does morphological awareness help? Well, it helps vocabulary development. It actually helps phonological awareness development, specifically for those children who may not have mastered that. And I should say now adolescents, or our students who maybe are a little bit later, still need some work in that. Morphology can help be the bridge to phonology development. As well as then, of course, it helps specifically with reading and writing. So let's think about what that is. So again, morphologically complex words make up more than half of the words in English language. And as children progress in school, they are exposed to that more and more. And as they're exposed to that, it's helping them to facilitate vocabulary and even reading comprehension. So why is that? Let's look at this. So for example, for vocabulary, children use familiar base words and suffixes to infer the meanings of unfamiliar words. So for example, a child knows the word pig, and they've been exposed to what a piglet means and have inferred that that means little pig. So now they're understanding that this second morpheme of let is helping to change the meaning of the base word, right? So now being exposed to a very novel word, for example, owlet, these individuals a child or a student could now infer, because they know what little is and they know what owl is and they know what let means, pardon me, that they can infer that that means little owl. So again, they're using a strategy of using known suffixes and base words to be able to infer new vocabulary meaning. And that's really powerful because different research, and there are different research studies out there, but in general, are the ability for students to learn brand new vocabulary words through direct instruction can be limited to, however many words. Some people say 10, 15 words a week, what have you. There's different research out there. The reality is that the ability to learn all words in the English language through a very direct memorization route is limited. And so for our students who are perhaps already behind in their vocabulary development, such as those with developmental language disorder, this can be a powerful approach to use a strategy to decode and learn about the vocabulary meaning of unknown words. And again, that's the power of that morphological awareness, and something that, again, is happening in very typical development. In fact, we won't talk about it, but I had done, or I should say we won't spend too much time on it. I did do a study on this where we did give known words and known affixes to kids to see if they could define completely novel, made up new words. And we found that kids were able to do this as young as third grade, and kids with typical language abilities. And even those children who had some delays in this area did have some ability to do this, just they were just not as advanced as their peers. But it shows that morphological awareness and that power of using it as a strategy can be helpful for individuals to, again, engage in the literacy and comprehension. And of course, if you understand the vocabulary, it also helps you to infer text comprehension. And so again, here's an example of astronaut is a known word. You might not know ocean, not, but you put it together and now you sort of can infer, oh, wait a minute, I think an oceanaut is like an explorer, not of space, but of the ocean. The other area of, so reading comprehension is helped by this. The other area that could be helped with morphological awareness is the idea of spellings. So spellings or chunks of units, in this case, affixes such as TION, allow for quick recognition and quick pronunciation, and thus efficient decoding as children and our students are learning to read, or if they're struggling to read, this can be a nice method or analogy method to be able to help decode unknown words. So there's the examples here of some derived words. Now, interestingly, let's think about that. How really does it help us to decode? So here's an example of an orthographic pattern, IVE, and our pronunciation, phonology, is dictated by whether or not this is a morphologically complex word. So here's the example of contrive. We know it's pronounced long I, and that orthographic rule, because in this case, where the section between the base word and the affix, it's not right there at that juncture. Instead, in detective, the IVE is actually the second morpheme and detect is the base word. That's why we know we don't pronounce it detective. So again, using your morphological awareness is what's allowing you to decode the orthography and the phonology. Here's another example of it. SH, we would typically do the sh sound, as in fish. And so in this case, with fishing versus misheard, you know that the juncture between the S and the H is between two morphemes. And thus that's how you separate it and know that you pronounce it as misheard, as two different graphemes as opposed to, or two different phonemes as opposed to one in the case of the SH. So morphology is helping us to read, even if we explicitly do not know, we might implicitly be using the strategy to help us. So it's not surprising then that researchers have found strong correlations between morphological awareness and success in reading, writing, and spelling, and that's for typical children with and without language and or literacy deficits. In fact, children with poor comprehension have specific difficulties with morphological awareness in the presence of phonological awareness. And so this is something that's unique where that might be why the comprehension is affected, or it could be one area, I should say. And thus, if we were to target it and help, that might help facilitate, in that case, comprehension. We know that for children with and without disabilities, and again, these are some meta-analyses, and this is why I pull these out, because 2010 was quite the year for a lot of really excellent meta-analyses, where we looked at how morphological instruction, how it was effective. And we found that it was effective for students with reading, learning, and or speech language difficulties. And specifically, we found that it actually had increased benefits above and beyond that of the benefits for our children with typical abilities, specifically for our children who have deficits in reading, writing, spelling, and or language. So this makes it, again, a powerful tool that we might want to think about.
Hey, Julie.
Yes.
Nell here. Can you go back to that last slide?
Absolutely.
I think this is such an incredible slide to ground us in the fact that by 2010, there was this meta analysis. That means they pulled together a convergence of evidence. But could you clarify if that evidence said the cognitive or linguistic skill of morphological awareness, in what that instruction, it found that the instruction was effective for students. So there's 17 studies prior to 2010 that told us this instruction was effective. What did that instruction, do you have a clue to what it looked like?
Yes. And I will show you some examples of that. Absolutely. But yes, there were some commonalities across those. And certainly that's some things that we want to be thinking about as we're integrating good and effective instruction. Thank you. Very good point. Yeah. So moving on, and again, we have some limited time together, but I wanted to very briefly also reflect on that morphological awareness, like other skills that, and again, when I say that, it's really a multilinguistic approach, because we always are focusing on sound, phonology, orthography, letters, and morphology together. They aren't in isolation. So when we think about these skills, they are really directly connected to our Common Core curriculum, which I know for all of you working in the schools, are really important, and specifically as we think about linking our individual educational plans with our goals and what we're doing in the classroom, right? And so here's some examples. These are 5th grade standards that are coming from Reading Foundations and Vocabulary, that you see that morphology is explicitly talked about in those standards. And so here you see that there's a discussion about knowing and applying grade level phonics, word analysis skills, and decoding, which here you have the letter sound correspondences, as well as syllabification patterns and morphology, such as roots and affixes. And again, using that knowledge to accurately read unfamiliar multisyllabic words. This is exactly the piglet to the owlet example of how we're using new knowledge to infer new words. In addition to some of the other examples that I gave you, where it helps us to integrate sound knowledge and letter knowledge. Also, again, we could even look to vocabulary acquisition. Here's one that's very focused on Greek and Latin affixes and Ritz's clues to the meaning of the word. And those of us who know and will go on, and in fact, we're going to talk a little bit at the very end of this presentation about some of the use of morphology in the classroom in very specific ways. And for example, from a scientist's perspective, Latin affixes are used very specifically as we label new types of different biological features, what have you, right? And so these can be used very purposely and thoughtfully as we link to the literacy and classroom curriculum. And then again, here's one other where it talks about, again, general academic domain, thinking about how we use our different types of knowledge about basic topics to increase our understanding. And just look at the examples that are given in these, just as a standard where perhaps it doesn't explicitly say morphology, but you see that it is filled with derivatives in terms of academic knowledge. So again, looking and being aware that this is really what our students are being asked to do. How can we be explicit in how we focus on this if there are students who struggle in this area? And so here's an example of one way to target, again, just one example of an IEP goal. I like to think about this in terms of, again, explaining meanings, identifying roots and affixes, and again, what context it's in. So just another example for you to look at if you're questioning how that might look. So Danielle asked earlier, what are some of the common components of effective instruction that we found in terms of meta-analyses and we continue to find? Well, one, and especially when we think about adolescents as one of the areas that we want to reflect a little bit more deeply on in this presentation, is motivation, especially our students who are older. Maybe they've been working on things for a while. Maybe they're not feeling as motivated or as confident or as comfortable with reading or doing things in the traditional ways that has happened in the past. Well, several features of instruction that morphology is very conducive to is to be thinking about how to increase motivation through some thematic ways. And this is why I love morphology, because I think it really lends itself. In this case, there's some motivating themes, such as a detective theme. In your resources, I have a citation by Goodwin and On. She's also one. Goodwin and On, both of them, I should say, did a really beautiful meta-analyses, but there's also a more educator-friendly article in there talking about word detectives and a lot of very nice examples for how to integrate morphology and thinking about the meaning of words. I know one of my articles, I don't have it cited here, but I think it's in your citations. It's Wolter and Dilworth. I believe that's 2014. We did a whole literacy camp around a detective theme, though that happened to be for third graders, but you could certainly do it even for older kids. You're on the verge there for adolescents, but thinking about how you become word detectives and doing a lot of word sorts, morphological activities around that. And it's really exciting. Again, I'll show you an example, but this can be very motivating and it appeared was a common theme across those therapies or instruction and interventions that were effective. And so, but the key here is also to have an explicit focus on morphological meaning. So thinking about what does the meaning mean and having opportunity just to discuss that. And always contextualizing language and literacy instruction. So what does it mean to use morphology and apply the strategy to reading, to spelling, to writing, right? And that's going to be really important too. So I'll give you some examples in a moment. The other part of this, and again, this is more of a constructivistic approach, much more of a cognitive type of approach where there's a self-discovery piece to many of these interventions that have been found to be successful. So not just telling students the rules, or not just telling them what a word means or what morphology means. Certainly there's some explicit pieces, but actually helping them to self-discover what are the patterns across language. And this appears to result in deeper processing and enhancing the long-term memory. So we'll think about, what does it mean to use word sorts or different types of activities that are very meaningful with this morphological awareness. And that is, in essence, creating a problem-solving opportunity for us not to just give the answer, but to create opportunities for students to self-discover answers. And again, many of you probably already do this in your classrooms or with your clients. Just like our phonological awareness, some of the other information that we've known for many years, thinking about the reading panel of year 2000, explicitness and contextualized and repeated. I don't have that in here, but it is absolutely, the repetition is part of it. It is the repeated opportunities, a repetition to actively reflect on and think about the meaning of base words and affixes in contexts such that our reading and writing is most effective. And again, we see this over and over. So let's look at that, what that means before we run into and go into any more intervention. Now, anything that I should look at here? Any other comments?
No questions. I just wanted to have us kind of ground ourselves in what self-discovery versus within an explicit structured experience looks like.
Sure.
And I think, setting that up with exemplars, being very clear in the I do it, we do it, you do it.
Yes.
I know exactly what you're talking about, but sometimes that sounds like I'm just supposed to give them a free-for-all and they're supposed to figure it out. So thought maybe a little more clarification.
Absolutely. So thank you. That's a good comment. So yes, it does. It means that we are explicit, we are scaffolded, we can be very directed in a way that helps to create. We are creating the context to make discovery of patterns abnormally easy. And so I think of it that way. So there's a lot of work and scaffolding in the background or around the words we choose or the activities that we do that create the structure for the patterns to be self-discovered in a much more obvious way. Because in the typical classroom or in one's typical language interactions, if we are working with students who maybe struggle in these areas, they are not making those inferences, like maybe they're typically developing peers who are seeing the patterns in very in very nuanced ways, in maybe ways that weren't explicitly focused for them. We're going to create opportunities that very explicitly focus. So that will come in the words we choose, the activities we do that are very directed, and also a lot of modeling. So you talked about the I do, we do, I put in the Southern y'all do, and then you do. And so I will model it first, we will model it together. You all might model it in small groups together. And then finally, we're going to ask you as a student to do it individually, right? And so that's a lot of scaffolding as well. So we'll talk more about that as we move forward, but absolutely scaffolded and set up in a very explicit way for students to see success. So our treatment rationale, again, if we're thinking about what are some of those key components that we know from our meta-analyses, from our research, are really rich for helping us to facilitate that. We want to focus our instruction on how meaning is changed based on morphology. We always, again, although I'm talking a lot about morphology, we're integrating all of our literacy codes. And I would say in this case are very this is, by the way, not to say that semantics isn't part of this or syntax, because they are all sort of part of these linguistic areas. But if we do think of triple word form theory, always thinking about sound, letter, and then morphology, meaning. We want to be tackling and hitting all those areas as consistent as we can, with repeated practice and opportunities to apply these skills in literacy contexts. So what does this look like? I am going to start, I very briefly, and because we are focusing more on adolescents today, I'm not going to focus as much on inflections, which is the earlier developing morphology. But remember, inflectional morphology is possession, plurality, or tense in general. That's how we can define it. And so how do we focus on that? Well, first off, especially with our students who maybe are a little bit older, who maybe they're not feeling like they want to spend time on these skills, that beginning always introduction, I always think about giving multiple examples of what I do. And I always emphasize to them, especially when they're not really wanting to or loving working on reading or writing or spelling because, you know, they haven't had much success there before. I always emphasize the importance of morphology will help them to increase their vocabulary and help them to become a better reader and speller. So it's easier over time, right? And then I introduced terminology. Now we're talking about adolescents today. I might introduce all of the terms that I use, that this is a derivative, this is a suffix, this is an affix, this is what a base word is. And in fact, we're going to start out with some mini lessons on this. Some individuals say, I don't use those words. We create our own together, or we talk about base words and we don't like to use the more jargon. I would say whatever is you think appropriate for the students. You are the experts on that. But let's think about that. The other thing, again, you just talked about, is it a free-for-all? How do we help to make things easier or harder? Well, one of the things is about the words that we choose. So the type of morpheme, again, inflectional, is typically going to be easier than derivational, which changes the word class or the type of word. Here's another thing, is thinking about the transparency between the base word and the derived or the inflected form. So transparent shifts are where there are no change in sound and or spelling of the base word to the inflected or derived form. So in this case, swim to swimming, if you wanted to use those words, students are clearly going to hear and see that the base word and the meaning of that base is still there, and then can talk about how adding inflections in this case change the meaning or the type of word that how you use it. Other types of shifts are more opaque in nature, where you change the sound and or the spelling. So magic to magician, you still see the letter combination of magic in it, but now it sounds differently, versus 5 to 5th, both of them are shifting. This one's really challenging. So depending on where your students are and the complexities of their, where they're successful, you might think about how the types of words you're using would also help them or maybe challenge them in these types of activities. So again, thinking through a multi-tiered systems of support, I really like to think about derivational. I'm going to focus mostly now on derivational morphology, with the exception of one inflected example, and think about how do you create a mini lesson, and then contextualize how you work through this, maybe with literacy ideally in a more thematic way. And then finally, how might we connect that in the classroom? And that will be the final moments in our presentation. So again, we talk about how do you create structure for self-discovery. Here are what we refer to as these word sorts. If you're looking for some nice resources that, in fact, many of you, I'm wondering, have already been using perhaps Words Their Way in the classroom. It's a very common curriculum, something you can get at the bookstore. You can just get that book and you don't have to have a really special curriculum. But the idea here is that you present words with different patterns at the same time that allow for students to start to see, hear, and get the meaning of the difference. So helped ends with t, plotted ends with ed, and grind ends with the sound D. But all of them are spelled ED. Why? Because it has to do with the ED at the end. That means something happened before, right? And so by presenting cards in a way with the I do, I have 2 or 3 cards. How do we now shift them in different categories? And instead of me saying, this would be the explicit approach. Today, we're going to learn about ED at the ends of words that say different sounds at the end. Instead, I say, hey, we're going to read some words today. We're detectives together, and we're going to figure out what is the code. So let's start out. I'm doing an I do. Helped, tripped. Just read these words. What's the same about them? They both have ED. They both have T. I'm going to put them together. And as you know, the more words you bring out, now the patterns start to emerge. And then we do it together. And then they do it in groups. And then you might ask them individually, right? So that would be a pretty typical word sort. And again, if you're having questions about that, or you want to see some different ways to do it, there's some references here, and others that I've put in your reference section provide some examples. I think they're pretty straightforward for inflectional morphology, again, for tense, plurality, possession. Now we start to think about derivational awareness. And especially for now adolescents, this might be where they are feeling the most challenged. So let's look at what that looks like. I will think, and when I'm emphasizing mini lessons on derivational awareness, now I'm going to start to think about how does morphology and the addition of an affix change the semantic roles or the vocabulary role of something within a sentence? How does it facilitate comprehension? So you can help children to do that reasoning by analogy. And then think about, again, where are the patterns? Let's think about how we do that. And finally, again, the expressive. So that's kind of more comprehension, which is a little bit easier than more expression, where we generate and do different word building activities, which can be super fun when you have morphology. So, I took it out of here, but now I'm regretting it. One of my examples of a word sort, which is much more about different derivational relations, is to think about those shifts between letter and sound change versus sound change only. And so sometimes what I've done is to say, think about and put pictures of two adolescents that look similar. They look like twins. And you say, oh, well, these are obviously related words like swim and swimming. They sound the same. They look the same. Let's put them underneath this category of 2 adolescents that look the same, versus a word sort where we would say, wow, pill and pillow. Wow, I hear it. I see it. But it has nothing to do, it's not related in meaning at all. The pill we take and the pillow we sleep on. So that's going to be in the category. You see these 2 individuals, these are best friends, they're teenagers that are best friends. They kind of look alike, but they're not related. And then you have this other category of words like magic, magician, where, oh, you have a brother and a sister, they're related. They don't really look alike, but they're related. They don't sound maybe alike, right? But here, look, magic, magician, maybe they look a little bit alike, 5/5. Wow, they're still related because there's a meaning connection, right? So those are some ways you could do some word sorts to do some pieces with that. And again, if you look at, for example, some of the references that I gave you, some of the work I've done, I give you very explicit examples of how to do that. But then here's the generation, given a base word, and here's a table, or thinking about how does the change of, how does the word type change based on the derivative that you've put on, right? And so these are some of the kind of activities that you might see yourself doing, again, in a scaffolded way. Doing the I do, you do, y'all do, and I do, we do, y'all do, you do. You could, again, this is very scaffolded, so you've given them in different ways. Here are the prefixes in blue. We have some different words where you'd say, take a blue, green, and red and see if you can come up with some words. Again, when you do these in small groups, students can really come up with some really fun words. And then the key is that you don't stop it. just coming up with them. You have to define them. This really helps students to begin to be aware of what these parts of words, how they are, the power of the word. This is another word. Lisa Green, who I do a lot of research, Laura Green, who I publish a lot with, she talks about the base word as the power of the word. And then you think about how these affixes change or adjust the meaning and the type of word. And again, we're just trying to get them to explicitly think about that. So our final slides today are thinking about, then we do our mini lessons in different ways. And maybe you start to see, if you're doing some multi-tiered systems of support, or if you're doing something in the classroom where you do some of these lessons and you start to see more master your students' understanding it, well, then you could really do some thematic contexts that are really fun, that require and allow for some application. And especially with some of our older adolescents, how do we again continue to do something in a way that will increase motivation? So here's one, again, one of my research colleagues here at University of Montana, Ginger Collins. There's an article we recently had in that special issue that we just talked about, talking about some camps and ways that we've done comics. And she has directed what's called the Mosaic, Camp Chronicle for years. And in this case, then taking Latin and Greek roots and then thinking about and creating superheroes around what does it mean to be thermo man or aqua person, aqua girl, right? Okay, you can imagine. And so there's lots of opportunities. And this is where we could do things in small groups where different individuals come up with what is the superpower if that's the character and the root that you've been given, right? So that would be a mini lesson where you're creating, you're talking about, you might scaffold it, you might be very specific. Ginger Collins has done this in groups and classrooms. So everyone's doing it, which by the way, this is a perfect activity where it's not just those individuals who might have an IEP who can do this, right? Everyone gets into this, but then we can be strategic about the roots or the types of words, the scaffolds that we give our individuals that might need a little more help. And then you extend it into discourse level writing. So in this case, writing a comic strip, developing a pamphlet, or developing a story around your character where you have to use those root words multiple times, or base words, right? These would be ways that you can be thinking about it. I note here, writing detective notes. We used to do that with our detective theme. Again, if you're wanting examples of what that looks like, you could go to Wolter and Dilworth, or that 2014 article, or Goodwin and On and their detective theme, right? But how then do you expand it to be doing some fun games, some fun applications? Words Their Way was a nice example of, then you can do even games like Jeopardy and providing, it has the word thermo in it and it has to do with, right? There's lots of different activities and you can use those resources, but again, just extending it. And in that case, having them write it. Even in Jeopardy, I had them write the answer in their detective notes, right? And then, thinking again about how do we facilitate this in a little bit more of a direct way. So this is, again, a publication that Ginger and I had done together, thinking about word journals and asking questions. What do these words mean? What do you think the rest of the word means? So, where is it that what we know what viz means? We know what the root is. So now what does it mean? And how do we then start to decode, or that's not the word, I shouldn't say for that, crack the code for what are these affixes meaning? And then what is the sound and what is the letter combination that goes with that? Right? We might see some dropping. In this case, here's an orthography lesson that has to do with adding these suffixes. The E in revise was omitted before adding the ION. Why? Well, sometimes we don't always know why, but that is the rule, right? So it provides some opportunity to bring some order, structure, continuity, and patterns as students who typically see spelling as just chaotic and our children with language literacy deficits do not see organization, order, or patterns often in spelling, for example. And so this can very much help with that. And then finally, I want to talk about disciplinary context in the classroom in the last 4 slides that I have to present today. This is some new research that I get really excited about, or some work that I've done with, again, Laura Green. And one of the themes in the literature, and maybe some of you are very familiar with this, is this idea of disciplinary literacy versus content strategies. Some of our colleagues, Tim Shanahan, for example, is one of a researcher in the field talking about what does it mean to have disciplinary literacy? And disciplinary literacy refers to thinking like the literacy context you're in. And so let me just explain what that means. So a historian thinks like a historian, reads and interprets and comprehends like a historian, meaning that you don't take everything literally. You really think about who is writing a story. Is it the slave owner or the slave, right? Very different perspectives. Same with a mathematician. Then if you're reading like a mathematician, the words the, less than, these are very literal words versus a scientist. And here's some examples of scientists are going to be thinking about in very, it's going to be the information is going to be very descriptive in nature. And in fact, I talk about this here, very much lends itself to morphological decoding. You have a lot of jargon, a lot of derived words. So how do you use that knowledge to think like a scientist, right? And so, although for the purpose of this talk, we could spend a whole hour on just this topic, this is an article that we just came out of thinking about, well, for those individuals with language literacy deficits, we need to be doing a little bit of both, because sometimes we use academic classroom content to think about applying a strategy. But there also is this very social skill of thinking of the different applications of literacy depending on which literacy context across your curriculum you're in. And especially as we work with older kids and older students, I should say, we really need to be aware of this, because those more perfected readers are really thinking of all these pieces. So here's some examples of then we are applying this in the classroom. And so here's some examples of some words that, again, just in one unit in a discipline, that then look at all those derived words. And so how do we help our students? And so we might think about, and this is again a term from the literature, is content literacy is more of that using and applying a strategy in an academic content area versus disciplinary literacy, where you're thinking of the social way you apply a literacy strategy. We might do both. And I think for our kids, our students specifically with literacy deficits, we do them a favor by doing both, because they don't always have a handle on the regular strategies like applying morphological awareness. So how do we do that? We can connect their words to IEP goals, and pardon me, we connect word study and the application to IEP goals. I've already talked about what that looks like. We can choose morphological words to focus on in our vocabulary and our strategy that are right from the curriculum. And then we can do these mini lessons that we've just talked about, how we break things down and help students know how to apply a strategy. But finally, and if we can apply this use of word study or morphological awareness, linking sound, letter, meaning into an academic discipline to help them understand how to link to the social way of adapting and using morphology. And so in this case, this would be an example of a lesson that's much more of a mini lesson where we discuss the types of affixes in a unit. Think about these Latin or Greek roots, reflect on those meanings and what they mean, and then do some kind of a literacy or written exercise, right? So we've talked about what that looks like. And then we link it into a more, we link it into a more context where, again, we're always thinking about the phonology, the orthography, and this, in this case, even syntactics. So that would be the change of word structure based on the morphological affix. So we've been talking about this whole time. So here's another example of what it might look like linked to the academic curriculum. And then we're going to discuss what it feels like to then examine and use morphology to infer our own meanings, right, in the classroom, and to discuss then what are these complex words in science, what are the meanings of the text, and ultimately what it means in terms of applying. So you can do generation of lab reports, write science journal entries where you're thinking about these new words. And this is that final piece that I really love, is the trying on of writing as scientists. So here's an example of it, where our mission is to try on what it means to be a scientist. And in this case, students are actually creating new words based on their experiments. So we give lists of existing solids, liquids, gases, forms of plasma, and a variety of roots and affixes. And then they create new words. In this case, hydrohelium, usually I do this in groups, is a developed gas you could readily turn to water droplets that float in the air like a helium balloon, which, by the way, totally made up. But what would it feel like to be a scientist and discover something new? And why did you name it that way? And you know, what was your system, right? That's what this exercise is doing, and helping them to think about words, right? But still, you're kind of thinking through. So it's not really teaching the content as much as using content, and in this case, the context of being a scientist, to try on disciplinary literacy in different ways. So with that, because we don't have a lot of time, I'm literally out of time. I just want to end on the note of what are the important pieces, and you know, maybe we'll come back. I'll do maybe another version of this at another time if we want more information. But the key here is that multiple language factors can be targeted in very rich contextualized ways. And specifically, when we think about the classroom and the content for even our older students, there's some really rich opportunities, specifically with morphology. Students of all abilities benefit from explicit activities that reflect on morphology, word parts, and patterns. And we can focus on those in different types of activities, which would be recognition or understanding through word sorts, or as well as then production. And then finally, always linking it to a language literacy context. And if you can, in a disciplinary way as they get a little bit older, as they think about trying on the role. So at this point, we'll open it up for questions. Again, Nell, I was limited in my time. I know I've gone right up to my hour. Tell me what we have time for, and if people have questions.
Well, we do not have any questions that are popping up right now. If anybody has a question, let us know. Pop it into the chat box or raise your hand. I just am really grateful, Julie. You gave us a really complete overview of the need, I think, is what I felt in all of this, that this is needed. It contributes to reading comprehension in a way that's approachable for a teacher in an everyday life of a teacher. It's something that if we just start to look at how these words have meaningful parts in them, then we can start having some explicit instruction around those parts. So really grateful for that simplicity in that. And there's a thank you shout out from Leanna Morton. Thank you, Leanna. We are and loving these ideas for older learners and often overlooked group interested in intervention ideas for younger students too. I gave him a shout out, Julie, that your mentor, Ken Oppel, has definitely put some research in the K2 realm, and actually has some true interventions that are in the research. And now, so it's coming. So we
of
are.
Those articles of mine actually very much are on some of those early. Usually my research is in the first and second grade level. So a lot of those articles that are mine are really focused on that early level, just as a note. Yeah, absolutely. Go on.
And you heard Julie talk about Words Their Way. it's very approachable. It's on Amazon. What we do with it is what really matters.
Yep.
And so that explicitness comes from you, and just growing your practice around not being afraid to teach this knowledge, because as Julie said, right, it helps us in disciplinary literacy and in content literacy. So thank you so much. Any final thoughts, Julie?
No, thank you for having me. I love to talk about this. And you see my email address at the beginning of this presentation in the handout. And if you have follow-up questions, let me know. And hope to see you soon. There's more to come, right, Danielle?
Yes, and just a reminder, all of that research she cited, when you actually go to it, if you don't have access or whatnot, let us know. But they do have actual exemplars in it of the actual research. Yes. For an hour-long presentation, we can't do it all. So just, give us a shout out. So thank you so much, everybody. It was great to spend this time with you. And thank you, Dr. Wolter.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye, everyone.